It was a quiet Thursday morning in Bethesda, Maryland, when Officer Frank Anderson was on his usual patrol. He'd been a cop for 15 years, but lately his badge felt more like a burden. Known for his quick judgments, Frank had become infamous in his precinct. That day, while half listening to the radio chatter, a sleek black SUV zoomed past his cruiser. Without thinking twice, he flipped on his siren and pulled the vehicle over. He approached the driver, a calm, middle-aged black man in his 40s. The driver politely greeted him, but Frank wasn't interested in pleasantries. He demanded the man's license and registration. The man, named George, handed over his documents, explaining that he was a professional chauffeur. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Frank asked, scrutinizing the papers. "No, officer," George replied, calm and respectful. "You were speeding," Frank shot back. "I don't believe I was," George said, his voice steady. Frank's irritation flared. He leaned in, his tone sharp. "Are you arguing with me?" "No, sir," George replied, trying to keep the peace. "I'm just saying I've been keeping to the limit." Frank's eyes narrowed, ignoring the calm demeanor. "Step out of the car," he barked. George hesitated but complied, stepping out onto the shoulder of the road as Frank began to question him aggressively. Inside the SUV, the passenger in the back seat remained silent, watching the situation unfold. That passenger was none other than Donald Trump. He had chosen to ride with George that day, away from the media and his usual motorcade, for a quiet drive to his favorite golf course. But this wasn't the peaceful ride he had envisioned. As Frank continued to press George, the rear window of the SUV rolled down. Trump's unmistakable face appeared, his sharp gaze locking on to Frank. "Is there a problem here?" Trump asked casually, but his tone was firm, demanding an answer. Frank froze. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had just profiled the driver of one of the most influential men in the country. "I asked, is there a problem?" Trump repeated, his voice now carrying an edge. "No, sir," Frank stammered, taking a step back, feeling the weight of his mistake. Trump's expression remained cool, but his words cut deep. "You just harassed an innocent man who was doing his job, and you did it because you assumed things that weren't true. That's not how this works, officer. Not in my America." Frank's hand gripped his belt as he tried to maintain his composure, but his authority had evaporated. Trump leaned slightly out of the window, his eyes never leaving Frank's. "You're going to let George get back in the car," Trump said firmly, "and you're going to leave us alone, understand?" Frank nodded, his pride shattered. George climbed back into the SUV, and Trump gave him a small nod before the vehicle pulled away. Frank stood there, humiliated, watching them drive off. But little did Frank know, his day was far from over. Back at the precinct, Frank tried to brush off the incident, telling himself that nothing more would come of it. After all, who could have predicted that Donald Trump would be in the back seat of a random SUV? But by the time he reached the station, the news had already spread like wildfire. His colleagues were avoiding eye contact, and some exchanged knowing glances. Frank hadn't even sat down before Captain Roberts called him into his office. "Anderson, take a seat," the captain said sharply. Frank's palms began to sweat. The captain slid a tablet across the desk. On the screen was a video clip that had already gone viral. Someone had filmed the entire exchange between Frank, George, and Trump's powerful words about harassment echoed across the internet. Roberts's face was stone cold. "Do you know what you've done today?" he asked, pointing to the screen. I didn't know he was..." Frank started to explain, but Roberts cut him off. "That's the problem, Anderson. It shouldn't matter who he was. You racially profiled a man doing his job, and now the whole world knows about it." Frank tried to protest, but it was too late. The captain handed him a suspension notice. "Turn in your badge and gun, effective immediately." Frank's world crumbled. As he left the office, he felt the eyes of every officer in the precinct on him. Meanwhile, at Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump was on a call with the police commissioner. His tone was calm but resolute. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about principle. That officer didn't even bother to check who else was in the car before jumping to conclusions. I can't stand for that." The commissioner promised action, but Trump wasn't satisfied with vague assurances. The next day, Trump's legal team filed a formal complaint against Frank, accusing him of abuse of authority and discrimination. The media exploded with the story, fueling national outrage. Frank's suspension quickly turned into an internal investigation, and soon more complaints about his behavior surfaced. Meanwhile, George, now reluctantly in the public eye, spoke out in a televised interview. "I'm not angry," George said, his voice calm. "I'm just disappointed. People like Officer Anderson make it hard for hard-working individuals like me to do our jobs without fear." His grace under pressure won the hearts of millions, including Trump, who personally called George to commend him for his professionalism. "You handled that better than most people would," Trump told him. "I respect that." As the investigation wrapped up, Frank was officially terminated from the police force. The precinct issued a public apology, and new training programs to address racial bias were put into place. Meanwhile, George received an outpouring of support, and Trump even invited him to a golf game as a gesture of goodwill. Frank, once a confident officer, now found himself unemployed and disgraced, while George's quiet dignity had earned him respect and admiration from across the country. And that's where the story ends. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more fascinating tales. Have a great day.